Good morning, Loa Nation, or good afternoon, Loa Nation, depending on when you're watching this. My name is Colonel Hall Sebring, and I was asked by Loa leadership to provide my thoughts on ACE as it relates to the fighter community. So for the airlift community, the examples won't be spot on for you, but I hope the information in there will help you think of new ways to do business so that we can be more effective and more efficient at our wartime mission, along with our home station goals and flying hour programs or annual training programs that we have out there. So hopefully this information will be most helpful to you. First, I'd like to talk about what was happening at Shaw when I was the group commander there from July of 2018 until July of 2020. And I was asked to specifically talk about the COMO, or Combat Oriented Maintenance Organization 2.0, that we started there in November of 18 after some discussions with ACC and the then Commander General Holmes, and then how we morphed that into COMO 2.1, both of those with the objective of how can we operate at home as similar to we were going to operate while we were deployed. And so first I'll start off with those, and then I'll kind of go into some of the ACE things that we were doing while we were going through that transition, and then maybe some of the results that we had from those organizational changes and some of the practicing that we were doing during those 2 years. And that continues on today under the leadership of Colonel David Good and his team out there at Shaw, and I know at other places as well. And so first, COMO 2.0 was right when I got in the seat there in July. We briefed General Holmes. He had asked us to come up with some things to do. And so what we came up with on behalf of ACC as our test that we were doing at Shaw was to move phase out of EMS into the aircraft maintenance unit. We also moved the E&E folks from CMS out to the aircraft maintenance units. And we moved realigned age, I should say, their CATs to align with the AMUs. Also, armament, munitions, and fuels were all sections that we realigned, and I'll go through a little bit more of that structure. And that started in November of 18 until February of 20, when we moved to COMO 2.0, or 2.1, excuse me. And so the idea if I'm going back to COMO 2.0, was how do I make an AMU as effective and as efficient as I can make it, with the idea that when it's deployed, I won't have a consolidated phase somewhere and those things will move back together. And so it inherently made the EMS role of phase a little less efficient at home. And we were okay with that because what we were looking at was combat effectivity while we were on the road somewhere. And so those folks moved into the AMUs. So we had to create a little bit different structure in there, kind of round out the sortie support flight a little bit more, and then just a little bit more pressure on those AMU OICs and chiefs to make sure that they were operating as best as they could. Then we moved the E&E folks out of CMS into the AMUs. So we split them into 3 sections, put them out there. Again, a lot of work on the F-16 has to do with those E&E troops, those specialists out there. And so we wanted more of that in the AMUs. And that worked fairly well, with the exception of there is still a backshop requirement for those folks to work on Rios bottles and the like back in those facilities. And so we created a rotating structure of people that would go back into there. That did not work out very well. So that was one of those things that changed when we went to COMO 2.1, and I'll talk about that some more in a moment. But what that did do was give some extra capability and some extra capacity out to the flight line to push sorties on a daily basis. The other thing that I mentioned that we did was for age, we realigned their CATs to be associated with our combat age teams, for those of you unfamiliar with that term. Realign them out to the AMUs. So we ended up with a blue, a yellow, and a red CAT. And they were directly associated with those particular fighter squadrons and AMUs at the time, the 55th, the 77th, and the 79th. And we did that to make sure that we knew when those units were going to go on the road, who was going to go with them. As many of you know, when you have a TDY with a multi-AMU wing, it kind of becomes a roundup there towards the end as you're trying to figure out who's going to go in that TDY. Some people are excited to go a lot of times, other people are not. And this gave some predictability, and they knew that if the 77th Fighter Squadron and 77th AMU was going to go on the road, they were going to go with them. So that provided some much needed structure for them, and also helped them with a little bit of their scheduling and how they had to have their age ready to go, aligned with our AEF deployments. Armament did the same thing. They did their CAST, Combat Armament Support Teams, and originally had those aligned by time of day. So they had a day shift, a night shift, and a mid shift, and then realigned into how they would support a particular AMU. And again, saw some much needed stability for deployments and TDYs, and also some increase in their ability to promptly reschedule and schedule all of the things that they need to do to support their flight line partners. Munitions did the same thing. The team ammo out there, they realigned their line D to, again, line up with each of the AMUs, providing that flexibility and that stability, if you will, for deployments and TDYs. Again, helping out so you have the same people talking all the time. One of the things that we were trying to get after was General Goldfein at the time had made some comments that when we come into combat, we meet together for the first time, on the goal line. And so we're trying to prevent that as much as possible, having the same people work day in and day out at home as they would when they were deployed, and saw some much needed gains in efficiency and effectivity with that lineup. Fuels did the same thing. With tanks, we didn't quite have enough people to realign fuels to have teams specifically supporting each aircraft maintenance unit, but we did assign drop tanks to each particular AMU, so there's no more sharing unless it was just absolutely necessary. Again, providing some stability so people knew exactly the amount of tanks that they had and the exact status of the ones that they may or may not need to take downrange with them. And finally, in a move that was already kind of underfoot through some other mechanisms, we moved the analysis and PSMD functions out to the AMUs as much as possible, along with aligning our QA inspectors with each of the AMUs. Again, the same people working together every day, so they learn each other's idiosyncrasies and nuances so they can be a more effective team on the road. We did leave a few of the PSMD and analysis folks back up at the group for those wing functions that they have to do managing across all of the different AMUs, but fully 90% of the folks were out in the AMUs. And that was the initial structure of COMO 2.0. And after a little bit of fits and starts there in November, started to work very well. We saw lots of different gains in the different metrics that you are all familiar with, and we'll go over those later as I finish up the COMO 2.1 discussion, which created the fighter generation squadrons. And as we're going along, I'd like you to also remember that you can post some comments down in the chat function, and we can get to your questions and answers. There will be an opportunity following this part of the briefing to get to those. So if anytime you have, just put them in the chat and we'll get to them. So then in December of 2019, we decided that we needed to change one more time again for greater combat effectivity and efficiency while deployed to what we called COMO 2.1. And this was a huge deal, and it is now fully in place at Shaw and started in November of 20 in the 388th Fighter Wing here at Hill Air Force Base. So there's 2 test stations for that. And that basically split the AMXS into 3 different squadrons. And we did that for a number of reasons. Number one was AMXS was far too big, in our opinion, for one squadron commander at the time. Had almost 1,000 people. Once we started moving EMS folks from phase over there, once we started moving E&E troops over there, and some other things that were happening at the time, grew to nearly 1,000 people. And that AMXS commander, as good as he could be, just couldn't get a handle on production and couldn't get a handle on all of the administrivia that was going on. And we were trying to create a super huge commander support staff. And the advocacy for the airmen just wasn't what it needed to be. Airmen didn't know who their commander was. They didn't feel comfortable going up and getting support. And that support that they did get was very slow. So that was one of the things that we were going to take care of. And so that's when we created the Fighter Generation Squadron. So the 55th Aircraft Maintenance Unit became the 55th Fighter Generation Squadron with a major in charge of it. 77th and 79th, same as before. We took our major DOs that we had at the time in AMXS, EMS, and CMS, and they became the very first three Fighter Generation Squadrons. So Major Stephanie July, Major Aaron Greensfelder, and Major Claire Vasquez were the very first Fighter Generation Squadrons in the Air Force. So it was a great day to be able to do that in February. And then we moved back 4 E&E troops into CMS, so they could be the core of that back shop function that still had to happen. It's one of the things that we found in AMXS. Their focus was on sortie production, and then sortie recovery, and then reproduction, and on and on. And they did not have the mentality that they needed to focus on the back shop. So we lost a few things here and there in terms of scheduling. We missed a sortie or two because we didn't have things ready. And so we fixed that by moving those people back into CMS. We also stood up what is called the MXK, which resembles OSK on our ops group counterpart. And this is where we could put a place to help with innovation, to help with creating a seamless environment across the group for things relating to deployments, things relating to TDYs, named exercises, and what we'll call the wing patch, if you will, for our maintenance folks. So it would either be a captain or perhaps a senior master sergeant or a chief that would go into that billet, and they would be in charge of, lesson plans and making sure all of the patches taught on a regular basis across the group, academics in one form or fashion or the other. They could also interact with our ops counterparts as we were coming up with ACE ideas, things that we thought were good ideas that maybe weren't so good for the operators. The operators could tell us, had an office to go to talk about things that they wanted to do that maybe didn't work out with how we could do things. And so having that office where people could come together and create new ways of doing business, new ways of being effective and efficient, putting warheads on foreheads, was a big step up for us. And it created what was not ever created when AMOS was first stood up, which is that OSK function. So on our flying side, when a pilot or other person goes off to weapons school and they come back as a patch wearer to their squadron, there is a wing patch that sits in OSK, and they look out across and make sure everything's standardized. Again, coming up with good ideas and how to fight. So we needed that same thing to stand up, and that did not stand up when AMOS did. So I think this will provide us some much needed structure for our maintenance and logistics professionals out there. So again, that's still in work and developing over there with Colonel Good and his team, and I think they're seeing some great results. And then the other thing that was interesting about how we created the Fighter Generation Squadron was we kind of also flipped where the people were. In the past, most of the time, you would see all of the people in the sortie generation flight and not very many people over in sortie support. They would own phase and they would own the tool crib. But what we decided was we wanted sortie generation flight to focus on sortie generation. And so that's where lives the pro supers. That's where the expediters live. And so it's very small and it's very focused on one thing, producing sorties. Sortie support is where now your APG section, your weapon section, your special section, those live over there. And that's where the care and feeding of those airmen take care of, and they are farmed over to sortie generation to produce those sorties. So now anybody in sortie generation doesn't have a whole bunch of EPRs, OPRs, decorations, and things to worry about. They are pretty much solely focused on generating sorties and making sure fleet health is good at the same time. And so that's kind of the overall morphing that took place at Shaw Air Force Base from roughly July of 18 and is still taking place to this day here in March of 21. So again, I talked about why did we do this? We did this because ACC was looking for different ways to increase combat capability, increase sortie production, and at the same time, increase fleet health. It's very hard to do all those three things at the same time. And they were looking at different ways to do that. As we all know, Mountain Home, operating under their construct, was testing out their structure. Seymour Johnson is coming online, testing out a structure. Langley and Beale and a few others came online, testing out different structures. So you can see ACC was trying to be very dynamic and very innovative and trying to find ways that we could be most effective and efficient in that combat environment, knowing that we might not be quite as efficient while we were at home, and that was okay, because everything should be designed for how do we go to war and be most effective there, especially in today's environment where we're really worried about peer and near peer competition across the board. So that's a quick rundown of COMO 2.0 and COMO 2.1, and we can get to some questions and concerns you might have over those in those chat functions, and I may run back to that in a minute as I go through some of the other things that were going on while those two big reorgs were happening. One of the things that we first tried to do was figure out what ACE was. Back then, we didn't have a document like we have today. I believe in October, a document came out. It is on the SIPR side if you want to go read that. It's about 35 pages. And I want to give a shout out to Jessica Watts, who we sent out to be one of the maintenance members as we were developing that. And they did a bang up job of creating a document. So now everyone can have a better understanding of what ACE is and is not. But at the time, we didn't really know, and we were trying to figure it out just like everybody else. And so we started doing some experiments. And we did two different experiments back then. One was called the Multifunctional Airman, and that was the 55th AMU, and then later Fighter Generation Squadron working on that. And then over on the 77th AMU, and now Fighter Generation Squadron, we were trying out what was called combat maintenance. And at the time, our 79th Fighter Squadron AMU were deployed over in the desert. And so what we were looking at was how can we figure out the best way to generate sorties on a number of different ship sets, if you will. So a 2-ship, a 4-ship, a 6-ship, or an 8-ship. And how few people could we use to do that? And how little equipment could we use to do that? Because at the time, some of the things that we were talking about where we would go off, let's say we're going to go fight in the Pacific somewhere, we would go off and land at a big main operating base, and then we might split the force and put them out in different places, and then we might split them again and put them out in other places. And so we would have smaller units at these locations, and how many people did you need to turn sorties in a given amount of time? And so we did a fair amount of practicing and some working, and we came up with, it was about 10 people per 6 aircraft. They could generate a 4-turn 2 and then come back home. We tried other different schemes, but that one seemed to work the best at the time. And we did about 10 different tests, some on station, some off station, some to Eglin, some to Jacksonville, and then also practiced some of that work out as the 79th and the 77th were getting ready to go out of town and deploy. And we also looked at, well, how much equipment did we need and what were we likely to get? Everyone would love to get a couple of C-17s. You can put a whole bunch of people and a whole bunch of equipment on there, but that seemed unlikely. It seemed more likely to us that we would get 1 or 2 C-130s in theater that were going to do some sort of roundabout to all the different, I call them lily pads out there. And what could we fit on there? And what do we need to fit on there? So that was kind of the focus of this group. And then they also focused on learning each other's skills. And we've all heard talk about this over the last couple of years. And so how much training do I need for a crew chief into specialist? How much training do I need for a specialist for crew chief and the fuels person that's going to go and the weapons people that are going to go? And so there was a lot of different discussion and a lot of different practice out there. And it's going to be different for every airframe. Obviously, we were very F-16 specific. And so the things that we tested may or may not work on a Strike Eagle, may or may not work on an F-22, may or may not work on a C-17 or some of the other special operations platforms that we have out there. So I encourage you to go out and try those things if you haven't already. And if you have been trying them, figure out the ones that work the best and really work on honing your skills on those. So at some point, you've got to pick one. And so shortly, after I left Shaw, they were able to pick, Colonel Good and his team picked the best of both worlds and merged them together. And now they call it MCAT, or Multi-Capable Airman Team. And it's about 12 people that are going to go out with these smaller groups of aircraft and be able to generate sorties, deliver combat air power as much as possible with the resources that they have wherever they land before they need to come back home to the mothership, if you will, and reset and then go back out and do it again. So that was some a little bit internal workings. And then I'm going to get into a few specifics of some of the things that we were working on and that many of you have probably also been working on at your different locations. One of the things I think that's going to help us when we get out into an ACE-like environment is speed. Okay, and so if you haven't read the book, The Goal, I highly recommend you read that and you start getting in touch with how you can incorporate the theories of constraint model. There's some Lean in there, there's some Six Sigma in there, but anyway, it's really about how fast can I make things happen in a safe and organized manner. And we saw some tremendous results at Shaw by using this. And I know Fairchild and Ellsworth are also well on the road to those theory of constraint ideas in their locations with their different MDSs that they have out there. And what Fairchild did was different than what Ellsworth did, was different than what we did at Shaw. And so again, I remind you that the specific examples I'm going to give may not work for you, but the ideas will definitely work for you where you are. So one of the first things that we did was look at phase and how fast could we do phase? If at all possible, so having been deployed a number of times, the first time for Operation Allied Force, and we had to stand up 3 phase docks for our A-10 squadron, the 81st Fighter Squadron, go Panthers. How do you do that fast? Because you don't want to do a combat phase. It sounds like it's a good idea, but in the end, doing a combat phase is not in your best interest. If you absolutely have to do it, go ahead and do it. But if you don't, if you can hone your phase skills at home to make that as fast as possible, that will pay you even more dividends on the road. And so we reduced our phase flow per jet by about half using some theory of constraints, using some Lean, Six Sigma, all that, getting a bunch of people in a room together from all different specialties, flight line people, backshop people, to make sure we had everything lined up. And we were able to do that and see some great gains. That's going to help you on the road, and it's going to help you at home, because when the phase people aren't working a phase jet, they can be back out on the flight line, helping produce sorties, helping do some of that hard work out there in between goes or from one shift to the next. The other thing that we looked at real hard was weapons loading. How do we do that? Who needs to be on the team? Are there efficiencies that we gain? Is there speed that we're missing somewhere? And so we had some amazing people in the load barn there working some innovative ideas. And one of them, Sergeant Tankersley, came up with a new way to load the AGM-88. So for those of you who are out there loading AGM-88s right now on F-16s, you are using what he came up with to make that faster. And so there was a particular block that you had to set up there. It always fell down and would make you misload the weapon. Could make you miss a vital hole where you need to put a pin in that could cause the weapon to slide off. And so his new method not only makes it faster, but also makes it darn near foolproof loading that AGM-88. So it happens right the first time, every time. And that's what we're looking for. The other thing that we looked at was we looked at our Navy and our Marine counterparts and how they load weapons on a ship, because they don't really have jammers out there. And we thought about, well, what if we're out somewhere and we don't have a jammer? Because if you put a jammer on a C-130, that's a lot of pallet position, a lot of space. Maybe there's a different way to do that. And it turns out the Navy and the Marine Corps, they load a bunch of weapons by hand. So we sent a team out to a Marine Corps station, Cherry Point, to learn how to load some of our heavier weapons by hand safely. So loading AIM-120s by hand, which was super nerve-wracking, and then also loading some of our 500-pounders by hand with a 4-person team. You may or may not need that when you're out there, but if your jammer breaks and you didn't bring a molt, how are you going to load that? How are you going to load that F-16 or that F-15, right? You may need to hand load it. Some of our taller weapon systems, you're not going to get them on those taller hard points, but some of the lower ones, you can still do it. You're not going to do it all day, but maybe one turn is enough. So we tested that out with a number of different people, and we had an all male crew for one, and we had an all female crew do it just to see if that was going to be a problem, and it wasn't. It turns out the real issue is how tall is everybody. You can't have an entire crew that is less than 5'5", or you're not getting the weapon onto the rack. So we had to do a little jockeying around to make sure we had height requirements. So that was kind of an interesting learning point on there. But again, you're not going to learn any of these things unless you test them out and you try it. And so I recommend you go out and try those new things. You've got to do it in a very controlled environment. You got to think about it, all the second and third order effects. But there are many things that you can do out there just in case something breaks or you don't have a piece of equipment while you're on the road. You still have to take the fight to the end. One of the other things that we were looking at, I told you, was how do I reduce the amount of equipment that I need while I'm on the road? Well, you can't do that with a little bit of practice and a little bit of ingenuity. And so an idea that had started over in Kunsan, we brought over with us to Shaw, and it was called the super seat race. And this, again, is a problem mostly with F-16s, but just, again, an example of trying to be creative out there is if you drop something under the seat and you can't find it, or there's actually a little bit of work that has to happen under the seat, you have to take the canopy off and the seat out to get to that stuff. So aircraft design in the 60s and 70s, not the same as we have it today, and those modular ejection seats that are going to come along are going to be awesome. But that's not how this aircraft was designed. And so to do that, you have to bring on a Cobra crane to be able to do that. Well, that's another X number of pallet positions we didn't want to have to worry about. And so we thought, can we raise the seat higher and be able to get under there and do that work? And the answer is, yes, you can. And you can raise it manually. Although I believe they're trying to develop some sort of small winch type thing that you could put on the canopy sill to raise the seat. So you may not have to do that just by basically doing a deadlift. And so what we found was, the space underneath a seat when you raise it to the maintenance position, is about this much. But now you can raise it quite high and you can get way under there, and you can do work on the seat, and you can do work under the seat in that position because it's all safed up and it's grounded. And it doesn't take very much time. All we had to do was manufacture a couple of pins to put into the seat so it would lock into the holes that are already there in the back of the seat and the aircraft rail. And it works like a champ. The only thing we have to worry about is how high do you raise it so you don't actually impact the canopy as it's up. And so all you needed was a little piece of foam on the top just in case you raise it too high. And it turns out that was a great way to reduce some time and reduce amount of potential pallet positions out there. Another thing that we looked at and we thought about was, what if you're out there and right now the book says you pretty much have to do arm and de-arm near EOR. But as you read it through exactly what has to happen and when it has to happen, and you really dig into it, you can actually do arm and de-arm in chocks. It's all there in the book and how you do that. But it does take some practice. And so you can save yourself a lot of sorties. As a matter of fact, the first time that we did this at Shaw, we saved about 20 sorties in the first couple of weeks of doing this, because taxi all the way down, get EOR. If you find a problem, you taxi all the way back, and now you've missed your range time. So you can't go off on your sortie. And then we also looked at, what are the people that we send down to EOR? They go down there, they're down there all day. They're not able to help with the maintenance where you really need it back in the chalk area. And you can't do a lot of maintenance at EOR anyway. At some places, there's no grounding points. So if you don't have those, now you really can't do anything. And so what we decided was let's try to do things in chalks. And again, something we had tried before at Kunsan that seemed to work. And we tried it again at Shaw, and it worked really well. Again, if you have a problem, now the jet just swings back around, goes into its original place, you chalk it, you ground it, and you've got all your tools and equipment and people right there. You can fix it, and you can get that jet back up in the air real quickly. So something that I think is effective at home for saving sorties. But when you look at where you're going to be on the road, some of the places that we go, there just isn't room to have anywhere to do it. You're going to have maybe a place to park the airplane, to put gas on it, to reload it, but then there's no place to actually do arm and de-arm. And so you're going to have to do it in the chalk area. So why not practice at home in a safe and controlled environment? The best ways to do that, the right people to do that, train, and then exercise it, and then you're ready to go in case you really have to do it while you're on the road. So again, looking for new and different ways to do business. We also looked at different things in terms of, again, saving space on that C-130. For an F-16, previously you had to have an anti-personnel run screen if you were going to do a maintenance run. Well, that's the most controlled run that we're going to do, right? Everyone knows where they're supposed to be, but there's no run screen when you're launching a jet out or when you're recovering a jet. And so we looked at the safety factor of that and did some training and thinking, working with the SPO. And maybe you don't need to bring that with you. Maybe you'll accept a very tiny amount of risk that you're going to put somebody in danger and don't bring that run screen. So again, an example that's F-16, but there are things on your particular MDS that I'm sure are similar. Again, it's about taking risk. It's about training and knowing what's going on around you, practicing in that safe environment, and then practicing in an exercise. And then you may have that capability when it comes time to go to war. I talked about jammers. There are other ways to load weapons out there. There's MOLTS. There's one other system that's escaping me right now that's available to you out there. So if you don't have a MOLT, maybe you need to go order one of those, and you've got to practice how you're gonna use that system. How do you load it on the jet? The other thing that we worked on was integrated combat turns. Those had gone away. We hadn't done those since I was a lieutenant. And when I did it as lieutenant, it took a lot of people to do one. So we decided that was something that we need to work on. So we worked on both cold and hot ICTs. And how many people do you actually need to do that? Back in the day, you had not only the crew chief and the weapons crew, but you also had your refueling person, but you had 2 or 3 safety observers on top of your ICT turn leader. It was a lot of people that were out there, probably unnecessarily, because we were unwilling to assume some assumed risk that was out there. I think with the training that we have today, you can look at that with your particular system and figure out what's going to work best for you. How many people do you actually need? And I would look at it in terms of how few people can you do it versus I need 15 people to do something, when really it may only take you 10, or it might only take you 7. And do you have to have a safety observer for the safety observer for the safety observer? Again, we're all professionals here, and if we've done our training right, we're using those training days properly, we're using our exercises properly, then we can probably reduce the amount of people on particular events and still be safe and combat effective. You don't want to go too far on the one end and be unsafe where you get people hurt. Now you're also not combat capable. So there is a balance there. Each of you will have to find that for your particular weapon system out there. Again, I mentioned we don't know what kind of environments. We need to be able to practice an ICT cold, or if we're in an environment where we're worried about missiles coming in on us, maybe it's just, hey, I got to get gas on this thing. And so it looks, maybe it's not a complete ICT, maybe it's just a hot pit. But while you're hot pitting, hey, maybe I've got time to put another missile up, or I've got time to put a bomb or two. Maybe I can Maybe I can load the gun on an F-16. That's going to be very difficult with the engines running. But there's probably a way to do that. We just hadn't figured it out by the time I left. So anyway, that's something that I would look into. Now, remember, I talked about what are some things that you can do that are different. And we talked about how do I load weapons if I don't have a jammer or a molt, and I've got to do it by hand. I need 4 people. A typical load crew is 3. Where does that 4th person come from? Well, it could be anybody. But what we thought was a good idea was, why don't we make it someone who's a munitions specialist in case we have to remove a fuse, or if something happens when we load the bomb and we need to readjust a fuse setting. We've got our ammo folks there that can do that. So now you've got your 4th person is an ammo person. Now you've got weapons and ammo communicating, which I know seems like a foreign concept to many of us, but it works. And then when you're doing that in the AMUs, and now you've got a munitions person alongside the weapons person, there's much more talk and dialogue happening. So now you have fewer times where you have miscommunication between what's coming out and going in and out of the munitions storage area, the configurations that is coming out, when you need things. So again, it opens up that communication network to be able to make you more effective and just communicate that much better. The other thing that many of you have been working on, and we also worked on at Shaw, was the rapid crew swap. So the ability to just basically turn a jet, give me some gas, give me a new pilot, and if there's time, we'll load up some weapons and we'll get some of those sorties going on there. It doesn't work for every sortie set, but where you can, I recommend you use that, because you can turn a lot of sorties in a day for our ops counterparts that need those RAP counters. If you're looking at things like that, that was a totally foreign thing to us when we were told to try that out. So again, being open to new things, expand your mind, as one of the commentators of the podcast I listen to, he likes to say that a lot. Some other things that you can do that you wouldn't necessarily think are ACE related, because they pretty much only happen at home. But home is where you prepare for combat. Home is where you train for combat. And those ideas, and people that come back from combat can say, hey, I wish we could do this. Now you can start practicing those things. So we came up with a weapons enhancement program along with our phase, and we were able to take our weapons personnel, some of our back shop avionics personnel, and run each aircraft basically through a phase of its weapons systems and clean those up. So we saw a dramatic decrease in weapon system write-ups, and I think it's pretty darn near a 100% weapons release. And then so definitely no misreleases out there. So I highly recommend taking a look at your particular weapon system, especially those that are a little bit older and probably have a little bit of dirt and slime out in there. Weapons enhancement program is a great idea. And I think that's been articulated across most of the F-16 world. I'm not sure if it's made it into our other fighters yet or not. The other thing that we did was, we have a hot training and cold training for our crew chiefs that are coming out, right? So they'll get trained up at Shepherd, then they'll go out to Luke, and pretty soon they're going to be going out to the fielded units where they'll get their hot training and they'll become a real crew chief, right? We don't do that for avionics. They just kind of come out there and they just get thrown in to the wolves, if you will. And we had CDCs back in the day. They were able to work through those, but we created that avionics mission ready airman program for them to get those 3 levels spun up on the very important critical tasks as fast as possible. And that, again, additional gains in capability and then capacity that you're going to have in your AMU or your fighter generation squadron, if you can get those new avionics technicians up to speed faster. And so that in-depth course was a couple of weeks long. It did take a little bit of resources away, but I think it provided much more ability for our fighter generation squadrons out there. And then finally, I talked about TOC and reading the goal. And we started doing that with some of our day-to-day maintenance tasks. How do we turn aircraft faster? How do we keep aircraft from breaking as much? What are some little things, some preventative things that we can do to make sure our jets are ready to go for our pilots so they can go out, put warheads on foreheads and get their training, meet their RAP, meet CMR? Because for us support folks, our mission is to make those sorties happen, and that they are effective while they're up there. Putting a sortie up that's not effective is not good for anybody. So we did some work on what's called deep cleaning, and that was basically, I don't want to call it a mini phase because that might give the wrong impression, but he had about 12 to 18 hours to take care of some very specific tasks. And it took a lot of work analyzing data on things that were breaking, things that were coming up, maybe some small maintenance tasks that were going to be scheduled later, so that you're increasing aircraft availability. But while we did that and fixed those small things, those jets started flying better and better and better. And if you get in touch with Colonel Good and his folks at Shaw, Colonel Hyen out at Ellsworth and out at Fairchild, and apologies, I'm forgetting his name right off the top of my head, Colonel Connor out there, they can provide you with the results that they were doing, the things that they saw, and the benefits of it. Just to give you a couple of examples, when we started our journey at Shaw back in July of 18, through May of 20 is the data that I have because I'm not the commander there anymore. AA, the 12-month rolling average in July of 18 was 61.5%. That is not good. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But we came in and tried some new things. And by May of 20, the 12-month rolling average was almost 71, so 70.7%. So again, some of those things that we put in place, some of that training was having an effect, and it was working, and it's still building. MC rate, and I know a lot of people don't like to talk MC rate. We can have a separate discussion on MC rate, but that 12-month rolling average was 66.2. And by May of 20, the 12-month rolling average was 75.1. So getting up there close to that 80, 81% MC standard that we had set for us. And finally, the M rate, right? So a lot of the things that we did was try to get that M rate to come down, because as maintainers, we can't do a whole lot about the supply rate. There are a few things that we can do, but we can definitely affect M, right? So that's going to be your phase. That's going to be how quickly that you turn jets from an NM condition to that flyable condition. And our 12-month rolling average was 25.4 back then, and then in May it was 18.0. So huge improvements, and it wasn't one big thing. It was a whole bunch of little things that happened over time to make us more effective and more efficient. Again, with that look towards how am I going to be able to operate out in a combat environment, which is what ACE is all about. So I hope what I've kind of talked about today, again, using some examples on the F-16 world, will help you come up with some good ideas with your particular MDS. What things can you do to make you more effective and more efficient, both deployed and at home? And if you're listening to this, I really hope you'll reach down deep into those fighter generation squadrons, into those AMUs, into the back shops, to your airmen, because many of the ideas that I just talked to you about came from airmen and staff sergeants on why can't we try this, or what if we did this? And not all of them worked, and some of them we combined into other things and had to start one way and make it go another way. But almost all of these came from our amazingly smart and capable airmen that are working on our aircraft and our equipment every single day. And that goes across the spectrum, whether you're in maintenance, whether you're in supply, transportation, logistics as a whole. It can work across to our ops counterparts. It can work across to our MSG counterparts. So please get out there and get with your young airmen and get their ideas and try them out. And so with that, I'll conclude by saying thanks again to the LOA National team for reaching out and asking me to speak on this topic. I hope I've done it justice, and I am more than willing to take any questions that you might have. Thanks. And if we don't hear from you, have a wonderful day and get after making some sorties happen. Out from here.